They say the 1960s were the decade of freedom, of rebellion, of music that shook the world, and movements that promised change. But freedom on the outside does not always mean freedom on the inside. Behind the peace signs and protest chants, there were children watching parents argue about war, watching society shift faster than safety could keep up, watching the world question authority, tradition, and even truth itself. What happens to a child who grows up in the middle of cultural earthquakes? What does constant change do to the nervous system? What does rebellion teach about trust, about love, about stability? This was not just a colorful decade, it was a psychological turning point, and the children of that era carried invisible imprints into adulthood: resilience, skepticism, independence, and sometimes a quiet loneliness no one talks about. Today, this silent emotional inheritance will be gently unfolded. Let's begin. Some decades whisper. The 1960s did not. They roared. They roared through television screens flickering in living rooms, through newspaper headlines spread across kitchen tables, through dinner conversations that felt heavier than the plates being passed around. You were small, but the world was loud. War was no longer a distant concept. Tinted homes through black and white images. Protests filled the streets. Music challenged authority. Traditions that once felt permanent were suddenly questioned, sometimes torn apart. And children notice more than adults realize. They notice when voices rise. They notice when parents argue about politics. They notice when certainty dissolves. Safety, for a child, is not built from laws or speeches. It is built from predictability, from rhythm, from emotional steadiness. But what happens when the rhythm keeps changing? When one generation is clinging to tradition, and the next is rejecting it entirely? The 1960s created a quiet emotional split inside many homes. Parents who had grown up in war-era discipline were now raising children in a time of rebellion. Authority was no longer absolute. Respect was debated. Social roles were shifting, and children stood in the middle of it all. Part of you may have absorbed the excitement, the sense that anything was possible, that the world could be reshaped. That change was necessary. But another part absorbed something subtler: uncertainty. Because when rules are rewritten in real time, stability becomes fragile. You may have learned early that the world is unpredictable, that institutions can fail, that leaders can be questioned, that nothing is as permanent as it seems. For a developing nervous system, this creates two possible adaptations: hyper-awareness, or emotional distancing. Some children became observers, quietly scanning the emotional temperature of every room, watching before speaking, listening before trusting. Others learned independence early. If the world is unstable, you rely on yourself, not because you want to, but because it feels safer. There is a difference between growing up in peace and growing up during change. Change demands psychological flexibility. It asks children to mature quickly, to process concepts larger than their years: war, civil rights, generational conflict, social upheaval. And even if no one explained it directly, you felt it. The tension in the air, the urgency, the sense that history was unfolding in real time. It can create strength, but it can also create a quiet internal vigilance, a subtle belief that the ground beneath you might shift again. So you learn to stand steady on your own, even if no one notices, even if no one asks what it felt like to grow up while the world was redefining itself. They say children learn safety from authority, from parents who seem certain, from leaders who appear stable, from rules that feel clear and reliable. But the 1960s cracked that illusion open. Authority was no longer sacred. It was interrogated, challenged, publicly doubted. Governments were questioned on television. Teachers were questioned in classrooms. Parents were questioned at dinner tables, and you were watching. Even if no one spoke directly to you, something fundamental was being rewritten. The idea that adults always know best began to fracture. The systems meant to protect people were exposed as flawed, sometimes deeply so. For a child, this creates a subtle psychological dilemma. If authority can be wrong, who can be trusted? This was not just political rebellion, it was emotional. Parents who once embodied certainty were themselves unsure. Some were fearful, some were angry, Some were swept up in movements larger than their families. Others clung tightly to old rules that no longer fit the world outside the front door, and children felt that tension. You may have learned early to read between the lines, to sense when rules were followed out of fear rather than wisdom, to detect hypocrisy without having language for it. This often leads to an internal split. On one side, a respect for independence, on the other, a quiet resistance to being controlled. You may not rebel loudly. In fact, many did not. Instead, the rebellion went inward, a reluctance to fully surrender trust, a habit of questioning motives, a discomfort with blind obedience. Psychologically, this creates self-reliance, but also guardedness, because when authority disappoints, vulnerability feels risky. Some learn to become their own compass, to rely on personal judgment rather than external guidance. This can look like strength, and often it is, but it can also make asking for help feel unnatural, even unsafe. If authority figures can fail, if leaders can lie, if certainty can collapse, then dependence becomes dangerous. So you adapt, you comply outwardly, but remain internally detached. You follow rules but question them silently. You respect structure, but only at a distance. This is not defiance. It is protection, and it follows people quietly into adulthood, into workplaces where authority is tolerated, but not trusted, into relationships where control triggers discomfort, into moments where guidance is offered, but something inside remains cautious. Growing up when authority was questioned did not make you disrespectful. It made you discerning, but discernment, when formed too early, can carry weight, because it asks a child to decide things no child should have to decide alone. Change is not only processed in the mind, it is stored in the body. A child's nervous system is like soft clay. It shapes itself around the environment it grows inside. When the environment is calm, the clay settles smoothly. When the environment is unpredictable, it hardens around alertness. The 1960s were not just socially loud, they were physiologically stimulating. Constant headlines, images of war, assassinations, protests, generational clashes echoing through homes. Even if your family shielded you from details, the emotional tone leaked through. Children do not need full explanations to feel instability. They feel it in tightened voices, in distracted parents, in the hum of anxiety beneath ordinary days. When unpredictability becomes frequent, the nervous system adapts. It becomes watchful, not dramatic, not panicked, just quietly alert. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, a heightened sensitivity to shifts in mood, tone, or environment. But in children of cultural upheaval, it often appears subtle. It may look like maturity, like being wise beyond your years. You learn to observe before reacting, to calculate before trusting, to prepare for change before it arrived. Because when the world proves it can shift suddenly, the body begins scanning for the next tremor. At the same time, adaptability became a survival skill. Rules were evolving, norms were dissolving, social roles were being redefined. Those who grew up in this era often developed remarkable flexibility, the ability to adjust quickly, to accept change as inevitable rather than shocking. This can become a quiet strength. But there is another layer. When a nervous system lives in long-term adaptation, rest can feel unfamiliar. Calm can feel temporary. Stillness can feel suspicious. You may find yourself most comfortable when managing something, solving something, adjusting to something. Because motion was normal, consistency was not. This is how resilience is born, not from comfort, but from repeated adjustment. Yet resilience often hides fatigue, because the body that adapts constantly also carries accumulated tension, not dramatic trauma, but sediment, tiny layers of unprocessed stress settling quietly over time. Like river sediment building depth beneath clear water. You may not consciously remember fear, but your body remembers uncertainty, and it learned to handle it, to function through it, to stay composed within it. This is why many from this era appear steady under pressure. Crisis does not shock them easily. Change does not paralyze them. They have practiced. But underneath that composure there can be a subtle difficulty fully relaxing into safety. a quiet expectation that something will eventually shift again. Not pessimism, preparation. A nervous system trained by transition. They called it the age of liberation. Freedom of speech, freedom of identity, freedom of expression. But freedom, when it arrives suddenly, can feel both exhilarating and unsettling. Because freedom removes structure, and structure is what makes children feel safe. The 1960s celebrated breaking chains. But many children growing up in that era were still trying to understand what those chains meant in the first place. When social norms dissolve, something else dissolves with them: predictability. And a child's heart depends on predictability more than ideology. You may have grown up hearing words like change, revolution, new era. There was excitement in the air, a sense that history was bending. But beneath that excitement, there was also fear. Not always spoken, not always acknowledged, but present. Parents navigating shifting gender roles, communities divided by politics, old values clashing with new freedoms, and children standing in the emotional crossfire. This creates a quiet psychological paradox. You grow up admiring independence. You learn that freedom is powerful, that questioning is healthy, that autonomy is strength. But at the same time, part of you may have longed for something steady, something that didn't need to be redefined every few years. A stable emotional anchor. When the world emphasizes liberation, dependency can feel weak. Needing reassurance can feel outdated. Wanting certainty can feel regressive. So you adapt. You become self-contained. You tell yourself you don't need too much, that you can handle change. That flexibility is survival. And often you can. But beneath independence, there can be a softer truth. A quiet craving for permanence. For relationships that don't shift with cultural tides. For promises that feel solid. This tension follows many into adulthood, valuing personal space deeply, yet feeling uneasy when closeness becomes too intense. Cherishing autonomy, yet sometimes wondering why connection feels complicated. It is not contradiction. It is dual imprinting. Freedom taught you to stand alone. Instability taught you not to rely too heavily on what might change. So closeness can feel beautiful, and slightly dangerous. Commitment can feel meaningful, and slightly uncertain. Not because love is unwanted, but because permanence was rarely modeled without tension. This does not mean something is broken. It means you grew up in a time when society itself was redefining attachment, to institutions, to traditions, to identity. And children internalize those redefinitions quietly. Between freedom and fear, you learned balance. But balance sometimes feels like walking a thin line. They turned out fine. It is a sentence often spoken with admiration. A generation that witnessed assassinations, war footage, social unrest, rapid cultural shifts, and kept moving forward. Strong, independent, resilient. But strength can become a mask when it is never allowed to soften. Growing up in the 1960s often required early emotional maturity. Big topics entered small lives. Adults were preoccupied with movements larger than the home. Society was loudly transforming. And when the environment feels unstable, children rarely add to the noise. They quiet themselves. You may have learned not to complain. Not because you were told explicitly, but because everyone already seemed overwhelmed. There were bigger issues, larger struggles, more urgent conversations. So your feelings adjusted to fit the atmosphere. Small disappointments were swallowed. Fears were minimized. Confusion was handled privately. Over time, this creates what psychologists call emotional compression, the ability to condense feelings so they do not disrupt functioning. It looks like toughness, but inside something accumulates. Like pressure beneath a volcano that never erupts dramatically, just simmers. Many from this era carry a subtle reflex. It wasn't that bad. Even when it was confusing. Even when it was lonely. Even when it felt unsafe in ways that are hard to name. Because comparison became a coping tool. Others had it worse. The world was chaotic. Everyone was adjusting, so you adjusted too. But minimizing pain does not erase it. It simply stores it differently. It may show up later as difficulty naming emotions, has a preference for practicality over vulnerability, has discomfort when others express intense feelings, not because emotion is rejected, but because you learn to survive by containing it. There is dignity in that containment. It built stability. It built perseverance. It built the ability to function during crisis. But beneath that dignity, there may be untended layers. Moments when you wished someone asked how you were coping. Moments when you felt small inside a very large world. Moments when strength was expected, and softness felt misplaced. The myth of toughness erases those moments. It tells a simplified story. But human psychology is never simple. Resilience and tenderness can coexist. Strength and hurt can live in the same body. Growing up in a transformative decade did not make you invulnerable. It made you adaptive, and adaptation, when constant, sometimes leaves parts of the heart quietly waiting to be acknowledged. Childhood does not stay in childhood. It follows quietly, into love, into work, into the way you sit across from someone who cares about you. Growing up in a decade of shifting values often shaped how connection feels in adulthood. You may value loyalty deeply. Commitment matters. Showing up matters. Doing what you say you will do matters. Because when the world felt unstable, reliability became precious. But emotional expression may feel more complicated. You might struggle to articulate softer needs, to say, "I'm afraid," or "I need reassurance." Not because you do not feel these things, but because self-reliance became second nature. Independence was not rebellion, it was adaptation. So in relationships you may give space easily. You may avoid being controlling. You may respect autonomy. Yet sometimes closeness can feel overwhelming. Not in dramatic ways. Just subtle discomfort, when emotions intensify, when dependency deepens, when someone leans too heavily, because somewhere inside dependence still feels uncertain. You learned early that structures can shift, that roles can change, that permanence is not guaranteed. So you love, but carefully. In parenting, this can show up as encouraging independence early, teaching children to think for themselves, to question respectfully, to stand on their own feet. These are strengths. But there can also be moments of emotional reserve, difficulty discussing inner struggles, a tendency to focus on solutions rather than feelings. It is not coldness. It is the language you were taught. In work, many who grew up in the 1960s developed a strong sense of responsibility. Having witnessed societal transformation, adaptability became natural. Change in careers, industries or roles may feel less threatening than it does to others. Crisis does not easily destabilize you. Uncertainty feels familiar. But overfunctioning can become a quiet habit. Staying busy, staying productive, staying composed. Because stillness invites reflection, and reflection sometimes opens doors to emotions long compressed. You may notice a subtle pattern, being the steady one, the reliable one, the problem solver, rarely the one who falls apart, rarely the one who asks for help, not because help is unwanted, but because asking feels unfamiliar. And so, emotional distance can exist alongside deep love, guardedness alongside loyalty, strength alongside unspoken needs. This is not contradiction. It is the echo of growing up between freedom and instability, learning to rely on yourself while still longing for connection. And sometimes that quiet balancing act can feel heavier than it appears. Not all strength is loud. Some strength is sediment, layer upon layer of lived experience, settling quietly over time until the riverbed becomes solid. Growing up in the 1960s required flexibility. It required mental expansion. It required holding contradiction without collapsing under it. You learned that the world can change rapidly, and that you can change with it. That is no small thing. While some generations were taught to preserve what already existed, you were shaped in an era that questioned everything. That questioning carved depth. It stretched perception. It made room for nuance. You can hold complexity. You understand that authority can be flawed, yet structure still matters. That freedom is powerful, yet stability is precious. That progress and loss can exist in the same breath. This psychological elasticity is rare. It is the ability to survive cultural earthquakes without losing identity. But there is something even quieter beneath that adaptability. Discernment. Growing up around loud ideologies often creates a quiet thinker. Someone who listens carefully before aligning. Someone who has seen movements rise and fall, promises made and broken. You do not rush belief. You weigh. This can make you appear reserved, sometimes skeptical, sometimes emotionally self-contained. Yet beneath that reserve is depth, because you have witnessed enough to know that surface appearances are rarely the full story. There is also courage here. Courage to evolve. Courage to question. Courage to stand independently, when necessary. And perhaps now, there is room for another kind of courage. The courage to soften. To recognize that the vigilance once needed for survival may not always be required now. That the independence that protected you does not have to isolate you. Awareness does not erase the past. It integrates it. The guardedness becomes wisdom rather than wall. The skepticism becomes discernment rather than distance. The resilience becomes grounded strength rather than silent endurance. You were shaped by a decade that demanded adaptation. And you adapted. But you are more than adaptation. You are depth formed by history. Flexibility carved by change. Strength refined by uncertainty. And quiet strength, the kind that does not need to prove itself, is often the most enduring of all. History remembers movements. But it rarely remembers the children who were quietly forming inside them. While the world debated freedom, you were learning what safety meant. While society redefined authority, you were deciding who to trust. While culture shifted, you were building an identity. You were not just watching history. You were growing through it, and perhaps no one paused to ask what that felt like. If parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you nodded along, it may be because your strength was never accidental. It was shaped, not only by music and movements, but by tension, by uncertainty, by adaptation. You may have been told you are resilient, independent, practical, grounded, and you are. But you were also once a child absorbing a world in transition, a child who deserved stability even as society experimented with change. A child who learned quickly because the environment demanded it. A child who carried questions that were too large for their years. There is nothing weak about acknowledging that. There is no betrayal in admitting that strength sometimes came with loneliness. You are not too guarded, not too independent, not too skeptical. You adapted intelligently to the world you were given, and adaptation is a form of intelligence. If this reflection made you feel seen, even quietly, know that you are not alone in these patterns. Many who grew up in that era carry similar layers. Resilience woven with vigilance, freedom braided with caution. There is comfort in recognizing shared human design. If you'd like to stay connected, this channel is a space where the hidden corners of the human heart are explored gently, without judgment, without pressure. A place for understanding rather than fixing. And if you feel comfortable, you're welcome to share your thoughts below, not because you have to, but because sometimes your words might help someone else realize they were not alone either. Take from this reflection only what resonates. Leave what does not. If something in this journey felt personal, if certain sentences lingered longer than expected, it may be because this was never just about a decade. It was about you. About a child who grew up while the world was reinventing itself. About a nervous system that learned adaptability before it learned rest. About independence that formed not from ego, but from necessity. The 1960s were loud in history books, but your experience of them may have been quiet, private questions, unspoken adjustments, small emotional recalibrations, happening in real time. You were growing too. And growth during instability leaves marks that are not always visible. Discernment, strength, emotional restraint, flexibility under pressure. None of these are flaws. They are intelligent responses to a changing world. If this reflection made you feel seen, even slightly, let that recognition settle. There is nothing wrong with the way you adapted. There is nothing strange about the layers you carry.
Many others shaped by that era recognize this quiet balancing act, valuing freedom while craving stability, standing strong while sometimes feeling alone. If you'd like to remain connected, this space is here for thoughtful exploration of the human psyche, a place where emotional patterns are gently unfolded, not judged. And if you feel comfortable sharing, your reflections are welcome, not as performance, not as obligation, simply as human experience. Sometimes your words may become someone else's reassurance. Take what resonated, leave what did not.